pani sa re ma pani sa ga re pa ma ma ga re sa ga sa ma pani sa re ma pani sa ga re pa ma ma ga re sa ga ma ga re ni pa ma pani ga re ma ga re sa ma pani sa re ma pani sa ga re pa ma ga re sa ga ma ga re ni pa ma pani ga re ma ga re sa ga re ma ga re sa ni pa pani sa ma pani sa
Janani Janmabhumischa Swargadapi Gariyasi. This is an often quoted line from our itihasas that it is twofold. We, as children, enjoy twofold motherhood. One, it is our mother who has carried us for 3 trimesters, 9 to 10 months, or some even 8 months. And there is another mother who's carrying us for the rest of our life, and that is our motherland. So it is Janani Janma Bhumischa. So it is very, very pertinent and probably even humane on our part to respect the civilization that we are born into and where we are living. But to respect any civilization, it is least expected that we at least know what this civilization is all about. In this course, I wish to engage you all and submit whatever little observations I have made as a student during my student days, my college days, and during my corporate life, and now into serving the Indic civilization. So in all these phases of my life, I'm sure a lot of you experienced people will be listening to this course. I have noticed that our civilization is very rich, and it has been successfully carried on for millenniums across the length and breadth of our country, despite all the hardships it had to face due to invasions and intrusions, and at times even instances that may amount to barbarism. So we, as adherents and followers of this Indic civilization, probably should mandate our own selves that we are abreast with what its history and what thereby its architecture speaks or says. With this intent, has this subject called our understanding or analysis or appreciation of Indian architecture has been formulated under the larger umbrella, which is Bharatiya Sarabodhani. In the due course of explanation, there are many proper nouns that come, and these proper nouns are from just not from Sanskritam but are from the regional Indian languages. So if I tend to mispronounce a lot of those names, they are not intentional at all. I will be very open to correcting them if you would offer me the feedback, and this is just done with absolutely a very noble intent. So if there are any mispronunciations, please forgive me. Now, when we deal with history, we often say history lies intact in the pen of the historian, or history is whatever is presented to us is the work of the historians. Reading between the lines, what it really means is a group of historians get together and present to us a certain document of the past. Of the past, when they present, there are chances that with their personal intent, they could have slightly adulterated the content to keep the content tuned to their ideology, or they could have genuinely wanted to present it but misinterpreted certain lines. There are historians whose knowledge in certain areas will be good, whereas in certain other areas of history won't be good. So to get a historian who's unbiased, who's absolutely very, very intelligent in interpreting the inscriptions, a historian who's able to present that in a very, very receptive and an acceptable fashion to get a wholesome package is tough. But we need to respect the historians who have worked till date. So I am not a historian. I have been a history student during my school days, as most of you would have been. But my appreciation of history comes from the very fact that I have been able to appreciate the Indian architecture. So whenever I have visited temples, just not in the south of India, in the north of India, in the east of India, the west of India, and to many, many temples in the Southeast Asia, I have tried my level best to harness as much knowledge as possible, gather, and kind of keep them intact the way it is or it should be. So we will go through the Indian architecture. Of course, when we go through Indian architecture, the history is inseparable. But I'm not going to talk about too many historical incidents that may matter to us because this course is on architecture. But if and when required, I will surely bring in history into picture. So even before we get into understanding, analyzing, critiquing, and appreciating our Indian architecture, we need to understand what does history basically rely on. So the first, it relies on literary sources. So you should have manuscripts, you should have books. If you would take this literary sources into two subdivisions, the second subdivision is something that we have managed to preserve because of a parampara, because of a lineage. It is called as Guru Sishya Parampara or Guru Parampara Prabhava Vaibhavam. So through those literary sources, which is through the Vedic sources of Guru Parampara, we understand some history. But that history will not be largely based on kings, but it will be based on sources of knowledge. Even further continuing before on these generic statements, I will like to get into the specifics. Let's understand the Advaita Siddhanta Parampara, the parampara, the lineage that manages to carry the essence, the quintessence of the philosophy of Advaita, which is non-dualism. So we have Narayana, whom we generally know as Parabrahman or Paramatma or Bhagavan. So from Narayana, the knowledge was passed on to Vasishtha, who was a Maharshi, from Vasishtha to Shakti, from Shakti to Parashara, from Parashara to Vyasa, from Vyasa to Shuka, from Shuka to Gaudapada, from Gaudapada to Govindapada, from Govindapada to the very, very well-renowned, very respected Adi Shankara Bhagavatpada. So this is the parampara in which the Advaita Siddhantam, the knowledge comes, is what that parampara claims. So if we look at Adi Shankara's period, it is roughly between 788 and 820 CE. So for our better understanding and as a benchmark, anything which we have known as AD, we will try calling it as Common Era CE. And anything which is BC we will be calling it as BCE. So before Common Era, BCE, and CE, which is Common Era. So between 788 and 820 CE is what we understand this parampara to have come. Next, we are going to look at the second parampara. From Narayana comes Lakshmi, and from Lakshmi comes a Vishwaksena. From Vishwaksena comes the very celebrated Tamil poet called as a Shatakopa Muni or Nammalvar. From Shatakopa comes Pundarikaksha. From Pundarikaksha comes Ramamishra. From Ramamishra comes the very celebrated Alavandar or Yamunacharya. From Yamunacharya comes the Mahapurna, who is often referred to as Periyanambi in the Tamil language. From Periyanambi comes Ramanuja, the very celebrated Acharya, who lived between 1017 and 1137 CE. So this parampara, which has its philosophy as a Visishta Dvaita, which is qualified non-dualism, also traces its roots to Narayana. Next, we have the third parampara. Again from Narayana, we have Brahma, the Sanat Kumaras, the Durvasas, Jnananidhi Tirtha, Garuda Vahana, Kaivalya Tirtha, Jnanisha Tirtha, Paratirtha, Satya Prajna Tirtha, Archuta Prajna Tirtha, and finally the very, very celebrated Ananda Tirtha, who's referred to as Purna Prajna or Madhvacharya. Now, he is said to have lived between 1238 and 1317 CE. So, we are dealing with Adi Shankara from the Advaita Siddhanta, Ramanujacharya from the Visishtadvaita Siddhanta, Madhvacharya from the Dvaita Siddhanta. So these three paramparas that base their structure on philosophy and to some extent on the theology have managed to preserve history. But that part of history is restricts itself only to knowledge and its various allied activities. If we have to look at a larger perspective to understand Indian history, probably we should have somebody like Herodotus. He was Greek and he wrote the very famous book, the Historia, and that talks about the histories of that particular land. And we had Thucydides. He was Greek again. He wrote the very famous book on a certain war. Now, these two historians whom we know in the Greek civilization, do we have historians like them? Now, even before we could understand such historians from India, during that period, we need to understand that during that period, we didn't come across too many such historians, but in the later date, we had historical accounts given to us, because even in the 7th century, Huanzang mentions that each province had its own official to maintain the record of the good and the evil events that would happen in the region. So we have Huanzang from China who came down to India in the 7th century who mentions about it. But before and after him, we have had various historical accounts of the kings, because when it is historical accounts of the kings is when you have a lot of history framed, you have a lot of wars that are detailed, unlike the Guru Sishya Parampara that I spoke of in a Vedic parlance. So we have Harshacharitam of Banabhatta, we have Gandhavahu of Vakpati, we have Vikramankadeva Charita of Bilhana, Kumarapala Charita of Jayasimha, Hammira Kavya of Nayachandra, Bhoja Prabandha of Bhoja, we have Rajatarangini by Kalhana. These are all historical accounts that speak about certain regimes or certain kings that would have come in various points in time. So we have literary sources on one side. Now let's move to archaeology. When I say archaeology, I'm talking about the inscriptions. So they hold the highest value. So such inscriptions could have been engraved on a stone. Such inscriptions could be engraved on a metal. So we need to decipher the character of the script to understand that. Nevertheless, that's a huge source when we see inscriptions. Then there are inscriptions which are engraved on rocks and on pillars. So when we deal with the Indian civilization, the Indic civilization, we find a lot of it is written in Brahmi script or Prakrit. Now, this is the second. So we deal with archaeology. Third is numismatics. So you might have noticed coins which come with a lot of insignia, symbols of kings and the script and the date as well in certain coins. And then we have seals which come. So those seals also are hugely important, very important for historians to keep the records of history correct and straight. Then we have very, very important, rarely found, but of high value, the foreign accounts. So we believe that there were some Greek historians who accompanied Alexander during his trail and are said to have documented a lot of events. The nitty-gritties on the city planning and how people lived. We have Megasthenes who visited Chandragupta. So we have the author of Periplenes of the Etherian Sea. We have the author of, I think he was a Greek who made a trip to the Indian coast around 80 CE. And then we have Pliny's note, which was written around the 1st century CE. And we have Ptolemy's, which was written around the 2nd century CE. We have Suleiman and Al-Masudi. Now we are going to go to the Arabs who traveled. We had Suleiman and Al-Masudi's accounts written in Arabic. And we have the very famous, the Chinese travelers. We have Fahian, who came in the 5th century CE. We have his account. Huanzang and Itzing in the 7th century CE. And again, a very, very celebrated Arab traveler called Al-Biruni, who's called Abu Rayhan, who's a contemporary of Ghazni. So his account exists. So we have a lot of foreign accounts coming from the European continent. We have some from the Arabian Peninsula. Then we have the Chinese. So all these accounts also talk about regimes and what kind of administration happened then. But of course, we also find certain accounts to be biased, but nevertheless, they are very strong sources of history for us. So when I speak about inscriptions, foreign accounts, numismatics, we talk about Guru Sishya Parampara, which is literary sources. So we should also deal with monuments. So monuments are the standing proofs of history. They speak about that regime. They speak about how the king built it over a period of time. So monuments are very important. So when I say monuments are important, I'm going to discuss a lot of monuments in the classes to come. Nevertheless, I would say that such monuments need to be visited by us. So I'm not making a pitch for any of your visits, but what I'm saying is a monument gains popularity only when people visit. So as I keep mentioning about a lot of monuments, I would request each of my Sishyas to make note of it and probably visit those places, because on the economy front, just not in India, even outside India, you're going to serve the local population by helping the hospitality and the tourism industry. Nevertheless, when you visit a monument, the amount of information you get of the monument, it's immense. So it's a request from my side. So even before getting into the large dynasties, the popular kings, the popular monuments, we need to understand history and thereby those historical sites in a perspective. So let me begin with how history phrases or plans its skeleton. The first is the Paleolithic age. Paleolithic age is the old Stone Age. And when we deal with old Stone Age, it is found around the Swan River, the Potwar Plateau, the Sangho. It's in the northeast frontier of northeast part of Pakistan, and it is dated around the 9000 BCE. And see, Paleolithic age, when we speak of the old Stone Age, they did not have sophisticated tools, and whatever little crude form of tools they had, they were used only for animal hunting. So the basic consumption of food, I don't know how it was cooked. Yes, fire was used, could have been used, but it was largely raw or semi-cooked food of animals alone. So probably, I don't know, I could be wrong, if proper forms of cultivation was formed. And how did they live? So they lived invariably in the rock shelters. They lived near the water sources, and all this proves that they lacked knowledge to create a civilization. So you still call it the old Stone Age. And they were basically hunter-gatherers who moved in small groups. So they will, you will not have a huge population settled like how we see in villages, towns, tier 2, tier 1 metros of the world. They were small establishments. There'll be a group of about 5 to 10. They will stay in one place, and then they were nomads basically. So very, very little is known about what language they spoke. At least from the Indian perspective of Paleolithic age, we don't have any evidences to say that this was the language that was spoken in those days. So I will just take you across 2-3 locations, whatever pictures I could gather, and a disclaimer that I'm making at the start itself for this course especially. I had to pick up a lot of images from Google. I'm not sure if all of them are copyright free. So a kind note and a humble request, if any of the photographers or owners of these photos are seeing, these are just photos to explain to you what our civilization is all about. So it comes with a lot of noble intent, sincerity, and honesty. So I'm sure each of you will appreciate that. So these are just from the open Google. So trust me. Now, if we have to deal with the old Stone Age and Paleolithic age, I could remember of 3 sites. One is the Bhimbetka. They're a set of caves and rocks found in Madhya Pradesh. Then we are going to go to 2 states in the south of India. So we have visited the central India and Madhya Pradesh, where we have a Paleolithic site, which is called Bhimbetka. And then what you're seeing in your screen is Ketavaram. Ketavaram is in Andhra Pradesh that we know of, and this also is regarded. Not even regarded, it is said by the historians that it is a place, a site of the Paleolithic age. And then we have Edakkal in Kerala. So in Kerala state as well, we have one particular place, Edakkal. Now when I'm going to deal with Mesolithic age, we need to talk about Middle Stone Age. So once we have crossed Paleolithic, we are going to come to the Middle Stone Age. What was Middle Stone Age all about? Middle Stone Age was a transitional phase between Paleolithic to Mesolithic. So Neolithic. So we have three stages. We have Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. So we have the Old Stone Age, the Middle Stone Age, and the New Stone Age. So between the old and the new is this Middle Stone Age, which is a transitional phase. And when we saw the Paleolithic age, Old Stone Age, I mentioned about people who lived in stone shelters. This was a very different stage where people started constructing small hutments. So they started living in small hutments, and that was a huge development. And here people of this age, the Middle Stone Age, also relied on hunting, fishing, and food gathering. But they also developed tools, innovative tools, made from large stones and small stones. They would call it the microliths, the small flakes. They were also used. And man-made huts, they were rudimentary huts that were constructed during this time. So we started moving from stone shelters to huts and hutments. And the primary form of cultivation, let's not call it agriculture. Agriculture is more sophisticated. Primary form of cultivation and lesser dependence on the animal hunting came during this stage. And this Mesolithic stage, the historians, the renowned historians, assign it between 9,000 and 6,000 BCE. So this is what Mesolithic stage or age is about. Now let's come to the Neolithic age, which is called the New Stone Age. And this is roughly between 6,000 and 4,000 BCE. And it is from a basic cultivation, they started moving to a fundamental level of agriculture. So you can use the word agriculture here because there is some sophistication, and animals were used for domestication as well. So we had a domestication of animals, and it was at an increased level during this Neolithic stage. And the relationship between mankind, animals, land, everything was established during this particular age. And availability of surplus food. And when I talk about availability of surplus food, it is about family labor together, and small granaries and water storage facilities were built. And from hand-turned crude pottery, it was wheel-turned pottery. For students of Vedanta, you'll remember that this wheel and the mud is often used to explain the material cause, the accessory cause, the instrumental cause, nimitta karanam, sahakari karanam, and upadana karanam. So this is what, when we do a course on Vedanta and especially Nyaya Shastram and Mimamsa, I'll explain what these causes are. So something that I wish to explain is, in the Mesolithic age, I could pick up about 3 sites roughly. The first is Bagor in Rajasthan. So in one of our western or the northwestern states of Rajasthan, we have a site for the Mesolithic age, which is called Bagor. And we have in Andhra Pradesh, which is called Adamgarh. In Madhya Pradesh, it is there in Adamgarh. And then in Andhra Pradesh, to the south of Krishna River, we find a Mesolithic age. Now coming to Neolithic age, which I was explaining. So we have the Payampalli, which is a site in Tamil Nadu. This is the picture that you see of Payampalli. Then you look at the Uttanur site in Andhra Pradesh. So Uttanur site in Andhra Pradesh, Brahmagiri, which is another site in Karnataka. And now let's go further north. Let's touch the northernmost tip. In Kashmir, we have Barzahom. So these 4 sites are often regarded by historians as that which depicts the Neolithic age. So we had a Paleolithic, which is the Old Stone Age. We had the Mesolithic, which is the Middle Stone Age. And then we have the Neolithic, which is the new Stone Age. So Paleolithic was around the 9000 BCE, whereas between 9000 and 6000 BCE was Mesolithic, and Neolithic is around 6000 and 4000 BCE. So these are the sites that we have discovered, and they have been scientifically proven and documented to be belonging to that particular era, as what I've mentioned. So as human beings, as a race, we started moving from stone shelters to huts to hutments to habitats, and our dependence on completely animal hunting, the raw flesh started decreasing, and we started slightly moving towards cultivation and then agriculture, the first or the primitive level of agriculture as well. So all these mark the first three ages, which is Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic, old, middle, and new Stone Ages. Now, often this transition phase from Paleolithic to Mesolithic, Mesolithic to Neolithic, all comes under a culture, because you see a transition. So there is a refinement in the way we live. So we try to move or head towards living in a civilization. So this is generally, this culture of this transition from Paleo to Meso to Neo is referred to as Chalcolithic culture. And we saw some technological innovation as well. The weapons which were used to hunt the animals, so they all started getting more polished and sophisticated during these three ages. Now, the Stone Ages are discussed. Now, let me take you to a very interesting site, which is again a beautiful discovery. It's called Mehergarh in Baluchistan. Baluchistan is a part of Pakistan, and Mehergarh is the earliest discovery that we have of this particular, this site is very important, because even before we move towards IBC, it's very important we understand Baluchistan site, which is Mehergarh. So it is attributed to the French archaeologists who at one point in time went along the western bank of the Indus River, and they spotted this particular site of Mehergarh in Baluchistan. Over 32,000 artifacts have been collected, and it was a farming village between the 7,000 and the 5,500 BCE. So during that period, now we are in 2020, we'll be moving to 21, 22, 23, 24. So when we are living in this particular 21st century, we have to roughly calculate about, say, 7,000 years back. So, or even 9,000 years back. So that's how this site is dated. And we believe, the historians believe, that this particular site of Mehergarh was a farming village. And we have many seals and terracotta figurines which date between 5,500 and 3,500 BCE, which have been spotted. So I will just take you through some figurines. Something very interesting is we have a lot of figurines that depict the female. They don't depict the male. So we have probably some historians say this concept of worshipping the Devi, the female form, started even then. So you see the first figurine, which is standing absolutely straight, and the next figurine where you find they could either the hands could have been taken, or her hands are holding the bosoms together. So this is the second figurine. The third is again very similar to what we have seen before, a terracotta one. And we find the hand holding the hip on one side and the other touching her chest. And you should look at the jewelry that has been shown in this figurine. So there are step chains that you can see, and there is a choker as well on the neck. And what you see at the top of the head of that lady is not a veil. It's a beautiful crown which is being pointed at various places, and there is, if you can see, covering her forehead when there is a crown, you also find a thin layer of perforations in some kind of ornamentation that has been done. So the concept of jewelry ornaments is not new, and you look at this Mehergarh terracotta figurine. The last one that we see is again believed to be of a deity who was worshipped, we could either assume that there is a head and the ears have grown that tall, or they could be horns, or they could just be parts of some other figurine that was attached to it at the top, but had been broken from the top. So we do not know exactly what it is. Even in this figurine, if you look at the chest, you find a beautiful layer of ornamentation that has been done. So they have been roughly dated. So if you're looking at these figurines, they've been roughly dated between 3500 and 2000 BCE. And yes, the female goddess culture is what we understand from these figurines. And interestingly, in this Mehergarh excavation, we have also found one of the world's oldest copper amulet. And some of the world's oldest pottery has also been spotted from this excavation. Now we are going to go to the trendsetter of our Indic civilization, which is called the Indus Valley civilization. Roughly while Britishers were ruling the larger Indian subcontinent in the year 1856 CE, two brothers who were British engineers were given the job of laying the railway line, the East India Company's railway line from Lahore to Karachi. And to get the material, they visited the city of Brahminabad, and they used the bricks that they could collect from that particular place. They needed much more. So that's when they spotted another village called Harappa. And the bricks from Harappan village was started being used for this railway line. It was then when these brothers met up with archaeologists who said that these are not bricks of these times, they are bricks of a very, very old civilization. This incident is what that led to the discovery of the very, very celebrated, the world-renowned Indus Valley civilization. And you will be aware that most civilizations that we have spoken of in the world, be it the Egyptian, be it the Sumerian, be it the Mesopotamian, be it the Indus Valley, the Huang, most of these civilizations were progressing around the riverbeds. So you can call them the ancient riverine civilizations, and especially the discovery of Indus Valley civilization put it at par with the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian civilization. And it is said by a lot of historians and archaeologists that at its peak, when Indus Valley civilization was thriving at its peak, it is said to have had over 5 million population, which is very, very huge. And what you're seeing on your screen is something very interesting. You know what you're seeing on your screen are just not shapes, and it is actually an Indus script. So this was the script with which messages were written and inscriptions were drawn during Indus Valley civilization. But the beauty about Indus Valley civilization is that its script has never had a proper decipherance or deciphering solution till date. So we know this was the script because we have plenty of evidences to say this was the script, but we are not able to conclude. For example, the Rosetta Stone in the Egyptian civilization helped them decipher what the pharaohs and the historians of the times of Egyptian civilization wanted to convey. We have discovered no such stone. Even with no such stone, historians are not able to crack the code. And the Indus Valley civilization is said to have thrived between 3300 and 1500 BCE. And in this long period of the Indus Valley civilization, the most mature phase is said to come between 2600 and 1900 BCE. An English writer who visited this spot of Indus Valley civilization after its discovery saw, and he was absolutely thrilled and surprised. He said, it feels as if he was surrounded by the ruins of some present day working in Lancashire. So since he had come from the US, he compared that to Lancashire and said, it looks something like that. So to say that how sophisticated Indus Valley civilization was. So where did it last from? Indus Valley civilization stretched from Baluchistan, which is currently in Pakistan, to Gujarat in India, and it started spreading across the Indian states of Rajasthan, Haryana, Punjab, and then it moved upward towards the northwest thrust of Rupar on the upper Satluj. So this is a large area that the Indus Valley civilization covered, and well, that did happen in the roughly in the 19th and the 20th century, and there has been a lot of work. Besides that, we have also made some discoveries. The archaeologists, the historians have made some discoveries in Pakistan's northwest frontier, the Shortugai site on Oxus River in Afghanistan, the Manda on River Bias in near Jammu, and Alamgirpur on the Hindan River. So these are all the discoveries. Now let me take you across a plethora of pictures. So what you're now seeing is a Harappan site in Pakistan. Can you see the base? So they are so well laid. Look at the bases. So the distance between these bricks is absolutely phenomenal. We do not know what kind of measurement tools they had, but their knowledge on town building was exquisite. Now I'll take you to a picture of Mohenjo-daro, another site of the Indus Valley civilization in the current day in the Pakistan, the country. So you find this, it looks like a stupa at the end. It need not be a stupa because stupa was built only during and after the times of Ashoka. So it could not be a stupa. It was a raised mount, and you should see the base of most of the buildings which could have existed then. They need not be multi-story, but there were some living spaces too. Now another picture. It's a Dholavira site in India. And this also belongs to the Indus Valley civilization. So look at the way those rocks have been laid. It was not a makeshift arrangement. It was something meant to be strong and permanent. And the next picture is again of a site called Kalibhangan in India. And this is a black and white picture that you see of a man and a woman walking by that site. And such raised walls existed during the times of Indus Valley civilization. Absolutely marvelous. And you should see this site. It's a Rakhi Garhi site, which is of the Indus Valley civilization found in India. And this is Lothal. There is another picture that I'm going to show you. It's of Lothal. So Lothal is a site in India. And yeah, so it again comes from the Indus Valley civilization period. It is said by a lot of historians and archaeologists that there are a total of 1,056 cities and settlements which have been found, of which only 96. So we have 1,000 plus cities which have been found of Indus Valley, of which only 96, say roughly slightly less than even 10%. 10% of the sites have been excavated. So our historical accounts, our understanding of history comes from what has been excavated, taken out, carbon dated, and it has been ratified or testified by a group or a panel of historians. So if there are over 900 sites which have to be excavated, probably we do not know whether we will stay during that period or it will push us further, probably even to something that I described first about the Neolithic, Paleolithic. So, well, we could be touching that as well, which will be a breakthrough for India. Now, Indus Valley civilization, it gives us an unquestionable proof of the existence of an extremely sophisticated and technologically advanced urban culture. The quality of town planning suggests that there was an in-depth knowledge of urban planning. So how do you plan a city? So it's not after you have 100 or 1,000 houses which are constructed left, east, west, right, south, and then finally you have some space left and you start using bitumen and coal and start laying the roads. No, that's not the way a city should be planned. So this Indus Valley civilization absolutely suggests that people who lived there, people who helped people in construction, had the quality of town planning in those days. And probably this was unparalleled in the ancient world. And the efficiency of the municipal governance also comes into picture because we have spotted a lot of sewage canals. The city was laid out in a very beautiful grid pattern with buildings and streets oriented in alignment with the cardinal directions. They could be the north, the south, the east, the west, the northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. So directions were given a lot of importance, and there was a very clear demarcation between what is a public area and a private area. So this is again very beautiful. And now I'll just take you to some pictures again. So what you see now in your screen is a view of the granary and the Great Hall in Harappa. So that is one. What you're now seeing is a washroom and a drainage system which is attached to it in Lothal. So India, you should see the
the measurements that would have been in the person who has designed this, who has constructed this, absolutely picture perfect. So you should see the bricks that have withstood all the nature's fury for all these maybe over 2000, 3000 years, and you should see how these drainage systems have been constructed. The next is a picture of a step well which was constructed, an artificially constructed reservoir. You should see that reservoir where you see see some pastures, right? So that's the reservoir, and you have steps leading to that reservoir, and it's a step well because you've got water coming from various directions and coming to this place. So you had the concept of a step well as well, because that area today we understand it to be a dry area. We don't know how it was, even though it was largely watered by the Indus waters, the Indus River. Now this is during that time, and yeah, the next that you're going to see on your screen is a beautiful it's a dancing girl made of bronze during the Mohenjo-daro time, and yeah, it's over 5,000 to roughly 6,000 years old, and very, very beautiful. You'll be amazed probably when we do the course on appreciation or introduction to Indian metallurgy, ancient Indian metallurgy. Will be able to appreciate. Look at that pose with which she stands, holding one hand on her hip and the other holding on the thigh. It's as if it's actually a figurine that talks. When I say talks, it is trying to convey some thought. It is just not a straight figurine with two hands held straight. There is a posture. And look at her necklace. You can call them three pendants which are attached to the necklace. It's not a choker. It's not a very, very long chain. It's just a single strand. And look at that bun which she has in her head. It's her tresses. It is her hair locks which have been put together as a bun. And look at her left hand. The ornamentation that has happened. It's like I don't know if we get these kind of jewelry today. We do have double or triple bangles. I've never seen these 8 or 9 coming together. It looks more like a series of bangles which are strung together. So this image looks immensely beautiful. So this is a dancing bronze, and it's a very famous one. So metallurgy. So the point here is metallurgy, metals, how to extract metals from the ores, how to mine them, and how to make them into figurines was there during Indus Valley civilization, a very sophisticated one. Okay, let me now sing a verse for you. Vaturva gehiva yatirapi jativa taritaro narova kaschit bhavatu bhavakim tena bhavati yadiyam hritpadmam yadi bhavadadhinam pashupate tadiyastvam shambho bhavasi bhava bharam cha vahasi. This is a beautiful verse, a verse from a composition called Shivananda Lahari in Sanskrit, an ode to Lord Shiva by Adi Shankara. Some scholars opine it could be written by a person after him. Most say it could be written by Adi Shankara himself. But the verse and its purport and its inner meaning is what is going to guide us now. So Adi Shankara says, whether you're a celibate seeker of truth or you're a man of the family, whether you're the one with a shaven head or the one who seeks the truth, or whether you're the one with the matted hair locks, so jata, juta, so you've got jata, or whether you're a grihastha who's living with Parvati, who's your consort, or whether you live as a vanaprastha in the vanam, which is a forest, or none of these or all of these. But I call you, Shankara tells, Yadiyam hrit padmam yadi bhavad adhinam pashupate. Hey Pashupati. Pashupate, pati. Pati in Sanskrit doesn't literally mean the husband. It could mean the one who's the Lord. So Pashupate, Pashupati, the one who is the Lord of all beings. You are the one who stays in my lotus heart, my heart, which has a lotus in it. This is what Sanatana Dharma Hinduism believes, that there is a very, very minuscule lotus in the inverted form. It's called Hridaya Kamalam. So he says, Hrit Padmam, Hrit Padmam. Padma is lotus. Hrit Padmam has to do with the lotus in the heart. Maybe you recite there, Hey Shambho, Tadiyastvam Shambho, Bhavasi Bhavabharam cha Vahasi. Take away this burden of my life. So this was a very common line to most acharyas and composers those days. So while I'm discussing Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, and then I spoke about Mehergarh in Baluchistan, then came to Indus Valley, suddenly I've taken you to this verse. Now I'm going to show you an artifact, a find from the Indus Valley site, and that's very important to understand where Hinduism and Sanatana Dharma is rooted even in the Indus Valley civilization. So around the 1928 or 29 CE, a seal was taken. It was discovered exactly 12 feet below the ground, and it was taken out, and it is believed to be made of soapstone. So I'm just going to show you that particular seal. What you see on your screen is a seal. Let's zoom in. When I'm going to zoom in, you see the beautiful face of someone. Who could this be? So there are many interpretations, and the seal doesn't just carry this person. It has a lot of animals and a lot of representations above, on the sides, and beneath. So let's assume this person is seated on a simhasanam, a throne. So because we see two legs, the other two will be behind. We can't see them. It's just a projection. So we have a simhasanam, a throne. This person is seated with legs folded. Let's deal with the legs slightly later. Now we see his hands are touching his thighs, extended till his thighs, and just look at the face. So when I zoom in into the face, I find two other faces on the sides. There is one on the left, there is one on the right. So it is now very clear through many sculptures which came in the later dynasties and during the later centuries that Lord Shiva is represented with 3 or 5 heads. So when it's 3 heads, it could be Shiva. What supports the interpretation that it could be Shiva? So when we look at Shiva in all our Puranas, his Vahanam, his vehicle, is a Nandi, the bull with the 2 horns. Now just look at his head. It carries a crown which has 2 horns, which could be depictive of his Vahanam. So you don't have to depict a bull there. The bull is his Vahanam, is depicted with his crown. And on the other way, if you look at his crown, doesn't it look like the front or the upper part of a Trishulam, which is his weapon? So you have the central piece, you've got 2 bends on either sides. It looks like a Trishulam. And he sits in a yogic posture. It's not exactly folded legs. If you see, his feet are touching each other. So the left foot is touching the right foot. So which is called as Mula Bandhasana, which is one of the asanas recommended in Yoga Shastra. And you find many animals around him. So you've got Shiva, you've got many Pashus. Pashu in Sanskrit literally means animals. So he is the Pati, the leader or the lord of all these animals which are Pashus. So this could be the seal of Pashupati. So I did speak about Mehergarh on one side of the Indus River, where we had figurines, the female figurines, which could be Devi worship. Here we have Shiva's worship, and there is another subdivision to this interpretation. Now, when we look at Shiva, it could also denote the phallus. A phallus is a representation of the penis of the male. So the male reproductive organ. So the penis is called the phallus when it's represented, and Shiva could be represented this way, is one interpretation. Do we have any evidence that supports that? Yes. I will take you to a temple, a lesser known temple, which is called Gudimellam in Chittoor district of Andhra Pradesh. What you see in your screen is that temple. And you see this temple is called Parashurameshwara temple. I'm not getting into the legend, the Sthala Puranam of the temple. What you see is the temple. And inside the temple, in the Sanctum Sanctorum, this is what you see. So if you look at it, it looks like a lingam. If you get closer, it is the head of an erect penis, and you have a figure which has been embossed or sculpted into the phallus, and that is Lord Shiva. And some date the lingam between the 3rd and the 1st century BCE, while some state it could be the 7th century CE. So there is a difference of, say, roughly 1,000 years. But when you look at it, you find Shiva being represented as a vigorous hunter. There is no Yajnopavitam, the sacred thread worn after the Upanayanam. There is no sacred thread. When I zoom closer, I find a lot of ornamentation in his hands. Don't you find that very similar to the bronze statue of the dancing girl in the Indus Valley? Now let's go closer. He is naked. There is a thin rope that's tying something that's been tied below his abdomen. They are extended legs seated on probably a Nandi or a Bhringi or a Gana himself. Some state it could be a demon whom he has vanquished. You should see his right hand. It either holds a ram or an antelope. I'm not sure. If you look at the left hand, it holds a parashu slightly behind and a bow. So Sri Rudram, which celebrates Lord Shiva, begins like this: Yata Yishu Shivatama Shivam Babhuva Te Dhanuhu. So it calls him as the one who holds the dhanus, which is the bow. So this is what you see. And he's got heavy earrings, and he's got bracelets, and he's got a necklace, and he's got a girdle. That's what I spoke, that which is below the abdomen, and there is no Yajnopavitam. So this is how we represent Shiva in a phallus. So if you go back to the seal, some say that this is Pashupati because it looks like a phallus too, to some. Now, is there a cross-cultural reference? Yes. On the other side of India, now we have been discussing the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. Let's go to slightly to the northeast, where we have this little Himalayan kingdom called Bhutan. And you have a fertility temple of Chimi Lakhang in the Punakha district. I have taken people on a yatra to this country, and I was amazed at the beauty of this country. It's a must-visit country, so beautiful, so pristine. You come across this temple in the Punakha district of Bhutan. It's called Chimi Lakhang, and it is this temple is is said to have been built for and by the madman. He was called the madman. In the Bhutanese, they call him Drukpa Kunle, and he had very unorthodox ways of teaching. And one of his ways was to use the wooden phalluses, the erect penises made of wood, to fly. So it may seem like the Harry Potter's flying scene, but this is what it was used. So we see a cross-cultural reference to fertility being denoted by an erect penis, a phallus, and this phallus being represented in the linga. So that's what they say to support the interpretation that the seal represents Pashupati, Lord Shiva. The second interpretation, they say it need not represent a deity. It could be simply a buffalo man, just a buffalo man. So third, they say it could be Mahishasura, because we've spoken of Devi worship. Mahishasura Mardini is a beautiful depiction of Devi, which will come across in many dynasties. As I'm going to take you across various dynasties, you will see Mahishasura Mardini. So when we deal with Mahishasura Mardini, the Mahishasura is represented by this Pashupati. I should not call it Pashupati, it's a seal, and it has got two horns, so it is representative of a bull or a buffalo, so it could be a buffalo man, so Mahishasura. And what is depictive of the Devi is Durga. Durga is the one who vanquished him in a battle. She comes on a tiger, and you see a tiger in the seal as well. So tiger represents Durga, the female energy, vanquishing the Asura, the male Asura called Mahishasura. This is another one. And the animals that you see around are running in various cardinal directions, being tormented or being afraid of Mahishasura. This is the third interpretation. Now, the fourth interpretation by some historians is this could be a Vedic deity. So, in Vedas, we venerate Agni because to perform a yajnam, a homam, a havan, you need Agni. So, you say Jata Veda se, Jateti Vedaha, Jata Vedaha. So, you pour your benedictions on Agni. So, Agni could be represented as three-headed. And if you have to represent Agni's tongue, he's called Sapta Jihva. He's got 7 tongues. So it is three-headed. It could be Agni as well. And the fifth interpretation, some say it could be Rishishringa. So if you're going to deal around the 3000 and between 3300 and 2500 BCE, that is when we are going to have Ramayana coming into picture by many historians who have dated it around that period. So if there is Ramayana, Balakandam in Ramayana begins with Dasharatha performing the Putrakama Ishti and Ashwamedha Mahayajnam, to which he called his son-in-law. So his daughter Shanta was given in adoption to the king called Romapada of the neighboring kingdom. And because of the famine and the drought that struck Angadesha, Romapada sent his daughter Shanta to lure Vibhandaka's son Rishishringa. Rishishringa's place is somewhere in Karnataka, very close to Sringeri. And so he was lured and brought, and then they were married and they were settled. So there are interpretations that Rishishringa could have settled in and around Rajasthan, because Rajasthan has Mount Abu, and Mount Abu is called Bhrigutunga, where the Bhrigu Maharishi settled. So if you go on to that side and then move from Rajasthan slightly closer to Indus, is where you got this Indus Valley civilization and the seal. So Rishishringa would have been the most sought after person. So Shringam in Sanskrit is horn. So though he could have represented a certain deer category called Rishyam with the single horn, some say he could be represented with 2 horns as well. So it could be Rishishringa as well. So this is the fifth interpretation. So this seal that I took of, I'm going to call it Pashupati of Lord Shiva. You can call it any way. So I've given you the various interpretations with which historians have come, and there is no a single conclusion that this could be representative of this deity alone. But many books of renowned historians state that this could be Pashupati. So our evidence, historical evidence of venerating Agni or Pashupati or even Durga comes even from the Indus Valley civilization. But there are some questions. So if you go to Egypt, I've had the opportunity to be to Egypt, and I'm amazed by that civilization which would have lived then. I could imagine what kind of a civilization it would have been. So in Egypt, you find a lot of representations of the pyramids, and you've got Sphinx, and you've got the beautiful Sun Temple at Luxor. So you've got many monuments which have lived, and you've got the ziggurats of the Mesopotamia. Whereas in the Indus Valley civilization, the IVC, we don't find many monuments, so historians are very skeptical. And but it doesn't mean that Hinduism didn't exist because there were no temples, because Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma, even from time immemorial, has believed that temple is not a place of worship, but it is a place of people getting together and exhibiting their skills. So we believe that worship could happen even from home. So just because there were no temples found in Indus Valley civilization wouldn't merit that Hinduism was not there then. But it is noted by historians that many temples are not found, or no temples or monuments are found during that period. Now, why did this Indus Valley civilization, which has been of such importance and study, why did that decline? So some say attribute the reasons like political and economical overreach, or drying up or changing of courses of rivers. So Indus and its tributaries could have changed their courses suddenly, causing to the death of a lot of inhabitants, or people moving to another spot, or due to overpopulation. I spoke about the 5 million population, and probably there were new tribes looking at the prosperity with which Indus Valley civilization was thriving. Probably a lot of tribes from Central Asia or from Eurasia started moving towards the settlements of Indus Valley civilization, which could have led to a lot of wars, and then the old tribes would have been defeated. but it did not vanish completely. So we find that a lot of practices of the Indus Valley civilization, either because of migration of people to the Ganga Yamuna system. So from Indus and its entire river systems, they could have moved to Ganga Yamuna systems and they settled there. Their practices continued. And in the Indus Valley civilization large site itself, we had one settlement called Perak. And that Perak is said to have existed after the decline of Indus Valley civilization till about the invasion of Alexander in 325 BCE. So we did have one settlement which survived. Or some say that Indus could have become very dry, the river which was the source, because the river around the river was where civilizations thrived. So they say that Indus could have gotten dry, or because of tectonic events, or general there could have been weakening of monsoons. There are many reasons. There is no one particular hypothesis or theory that supports it. Many reasons could have led to it, but nevertheless, John Key in the History of India, the book, John Key states, this being the case, I'm just quoting him verbatim, this being the case, the total, albeit gradual eclipse of Harappan civilization is all the more mystifying. Sumerian civilization led on to that of Babylon. Egypt's old kingdom was succeeded by the Middle Kingdom. China's dynastic succession scarcely faltered. But in the Indian subcontinent, the first great experiment in urban living, in political organization, and in commercial enterprise disappeared without trace beneath the sand and the silt. So I'm going to show you a depiction of how a site of the Indus Valley civilization looks from the top. So this is a beautiful site that you see. You find equally built chambers. They got high walls, and you've got some circles as well. So they knew of shapes, rectangles, triangles, and their understanding of measurements and shapes was exemplary. But you find them, you can call them ruins or just remains. So this is what we have of Indus Valley civilization. Now, when we speak of Indus Valley civilization, it's not a stop all or know all there. There are other things that we need to know of, discoveries which are still being found. So the first that I'm going to take you across is Arikamedu. It is near Puducherry. Puducherry is a union territory of India. It is in the state of Tamil Nadu. So Arikamedu, it finds mention as Poduke in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. The Greek account, this place is mentioned as Poduke. And Ptolemy in the Roman Empire, that's what even he mentions of this place. And some historians and archaeologists conclude that this could have been the Greek trading post that once traded with Rome in the 2nd century BCE to the 8th century CE. For a span of say 1,000 years, you had this as a trading post. So Arikamedu. So this is the entrance. So the entrance that you see is not the old one. It's a recent one. When I say recent, about 350 to 400 years old. But when we get into the site, we find a beautiful picture, the remains of Arikamedu. So I couldn't find proper resolution pictures of Arikamedu. Then I'm going to take you to another place in Tamil Nadu, again in the south of India, in the Erode district. So it's called Kodumanal, and it was called Kodumanam or Pattiripattu in Sangam period. So Sangam period is another period which we'll be discussing in the literature of regional languages. I'll talk about that Sangam literature in detail then. So during the Sangam period, along the banks of river Noyal is this Kodumanal, and this place played a major role in Indo-Roman trade relations. And we find arrowheads, swords, iron melting furnaces, pottery with Tamil scripts. So we found all this as evidences to support that this was between the 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE. So again, this lasted for about 400 years, which is very strong. A Kodumanal. Next, you see a beautiful picture also here. So I'm going to show you this picture in the screen as well. And these are the remains of that place. Next is Adichanallur. And it is again in the south of India, in Tamil Nadu. It is in a district called Thoothukudi, which was erstwhile called Tuticorin. And you find a number of urns with Tamil Brahmi script. So Brahmi script is separate, Tamil is separate, but this was a combination, like how we call Maniprabhala during the medieval period. It was called Tamil Brahmi script, dated roughly between the 1000 and the 600 BCE. So we have the 6th century CE to the 10th century CE. So it's quite very, very old. And I'll show you a picture of how this site looks. So what you're seeing in front of your eyes is a beautiful overview of how this Adichanallur site looks. Now, I'm going to move to another southern state, slightly above Tamil Nadu. It is in the state of Karnataka. So in the district, Gulbarga district, you have a place called Kanaganahalli. Kanaganahalli generally in Kannada, the South Indian language, denotes a village. Kanaganahalli is a village. Between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century AD, we have a beautiful Buddhist stupa which was patronized by the Mahayana and the Hinayana. Again, to all my Sishyas, when I speak about comparative religion, I will be taking up Buddhism as well. I'll be discussing about the 4 branches, how they have been coupled. So you've got the Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Yogachara, Shunyavada. Now they've been brought under 2, the idealistic and the realistic path, which is called the Hinayana and Mahayana. Understand them to be the two large subsects of Buddhism. So this stupa was patronized by both the subsects, so which was Mahayana and the Hinayana, and there is a depiction of Ashoka. So in this Kanaganahalli site, I'll show you this picture. Can you see this picture? So it's a beautiful picture of Ashoka. Look at the posture with which he stands, and you have him with his female attendants. They could have not been his queens. They could have been attendants, because we don't find much of a difference between the 2 of them. So they could be attendants who would be attending to Ashoka. And this is a depiction of Ashoka, and some historians say it could be his queens as well. So we are not sure whether they're just female attendants or queens. Let's assume they are 2 females, could be queens or attendants. And then there is another picture that I'm going to show you on your screen. And that is again a find from this Kanaganahalli stupa, which is a Dharma Chakra. So in Pali, it was called Dhamma Chakra. So Dhamma Chakra is Dharma Chakra in Sanskritam. So Dharma Chakra is very, very depictive when we go further to the Gupta and the Mauryan dynasty, especially the Shungas, the Guptas, and especially the Mauryas. We'll have Buddhism playing a role. So you have this Dhamma Chakra. So this is Kanaganahalli, which is again a very old site. So Indus Valley civilization was absolutely a benchmark. But beyond the Indus Valley civilization also, we have had many, many finds. Now, the latest find, which is very, very celebrated, is again a settlement around the Sangam period near Madurai, a celebrated city in Tamil Nadu, which is a southern state in India. It is again during the Sangam period along the banks of river Vaigai. And the archaeologists and later some historians who have read the evidences state that the finds depict that this is the ancient culture of the Tamil people. And there is another site which is found very close to Kiradi, which is called Manalur. And during the Sangam era, we find a lot of research scholars who say that it was called Perumanalur. But some say that Perumanalur is a different site. In whichever case, Perumanalur and Manalur come around the same topography, and it was spread across 80 acres. So we find this Kiradi excavation is a breakthrough. So we find kitchen wells, we have brick walls, we have roof tiles, we have pottery. Just getting one of this wouldn't suffice to call it a huge civilization or a huge settlement. We have kitchen walls, we have brick walls, we have roof tiles, we have pottery, we have Tamil Brahmi script etched on plates, we have a sewage canal facility, we have Aretine type ceramics. So these ceramics established that we could have traded with the Roman Empire even then. So this Kiradi site is dated between the 5th century BCE and the 3rd century CE. So it could have lasted for about 800 years that this settlement lived. So Kiradi. So I'll take you across some pictures. Can you see the brick wall? So this is a beautiful picture of the brick wall. Now it's one over the other. So there's a layer there. And then I'm going to take you across to some pottery, some materials or evidences of pottery that have been found in Kiradi site. And Now I'm going to take you to another picture. Can you see the excavation blocks? So it's not completely excavated, the area. So we have some excavation blocks. Yeah, something that adds value to excavation is metallurgy, undoubtedly, because you need to know what is mining, you need to learn mining, you need to mine, you need to take the ore, and then you need to have the ability or technique to separate metals from impurities, then know what metal it is, then use suitably other metals in the right proportion and prepare ornaments. So I'm going to show you on screen. So this has the English word and the Tamil word as well. So I will read the Tamil word and the English word for you. So what you see below in this, so let's read it from top to bottom. So you're going to go to the second row. So so the first one that you find as a huge egg-like structure with a dropping below and with a holder at the top, it's quite huge. The second column figure at the top, it's a Tongattan, which is a pendant, and below that is a needle. It's an Usi. In Tamil we call it Usi. And on the right hand side from your side, I'm going to take you to the third column. So we have got a mani, which is a bead. It's broken. Then below that there is a complete mani, which has got a hole, a perforation. Probably it was used for stringing. And that's a mani, which is a bead. And then below that is again a plate, a tagadu. It's a plate. Now let's go to the first column. So the first column has a pottan, which is a button. So buttons were used for dresses those days, made of gold. So what I'm showing you is gold. Then valayam, which is a ring. So this is not completely a ring. Partially we have found it's a ring. So these are the Keezhadi findings. So this adds a lot of value to our understanding of how ancient sites worked in those days.
Namaskaram, dear Sishyas of Bharatiya Sarabodhani Level 1, Batch 1. I will be more than happy to be speaking to you all live on the 24th of October at 3 p.m. IST. Sishyas who are based in India, it is 3 p.m. Sishyas who are in the Far East from Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, as well as Sishyas in the Middle East and in the European continent and UK can adjust to these timings of 3 p.m. IST. I am also aware that this may not be suitable for Sishyas in the US because it may be night for you all. So you can all watch the video after the live presentation on the YouTube channel. Those of you who can, I would urge all of you to kindly watch my Thanksgiving to all the Sishyas of Batch 1 on the 24th of October in my YouTube channel, Dushyant Sridhar. Alongside Sishyas who have registered for Bharatiya Sarabodhani Level 1 Batch 2, which will be commencing on October 25th, I will also be sharing a welcome message along with this video on the 24th of October at 3 p.m. IST. Kindly tune in to my YouTube channel and please do join us. Namaskaram.